What's good? It's Woog. We've just wrapped up Anthony Joshua versus Jermaine Franklin, and Anthony Joshua wins via unanimous decision in what I would not consider a great fight. I thought it was an interesting fight. I thought it was a pretty good fight, especially in the last few rounds. I thought that the intensity and the action picked up a bit in the last 3 to 4 rounds. But Anthony Joshua is your winner. He won by the scorecards of 118 to 111 for one judge, and then 2 cards had it 117, 111, which is basically 9 rounds to 3. And I thought you could give Jermaine Franklin maybe 1 or 2 rounds. I thought the 3 would be the absolute ceiling that you could give Jermaine Franklin in this fight. I think that 10 rounds to 2 is probably right around the right spot, but I wouldn't argue with 9 rounds to 3 either. Anthony Joshua was winning the vast majority of the rounds. In the latter stages of the fight, there were moments where Jermaine Franklin was starting to land bigger shots, which Anthony Joshua took well. But in those same rounds, Anthony Joshua was hitting Jermaine Franklin with a lot of his better shots of the fight, which Jermaine Franklin took well. Both of these guys, I thought, showed pretty good conditioning. Both of these guys showed a resilient chin. I think that this was a good fight. It wasn't a barn burner or anything, but let's talk a little bit about what we saw from Anthony Joshua under the tutelage of Derrick James, the famed trainer, because this is their first fight together. So a lot of people were wondering, well, are we going to see anything noticeably different about Anthony Joshua in his fight style? Well, the first thing that he did was, I thought that he established the jab pretty well. And this was a pummeling jab. Now, Anthony Joshua, I thought, had a good jab before. I thought he used his jab well against Kubrat Pulev. I thought he used it really well against Andy Ruiz in that rematch. I thought that he used it well against Usyk, even though Usyk is one of the more challenging Rubik's Cubes in the sport. I thought that Anthony Joshua's had a good jab. But I did see the way that he was throwing the jab pretty quickly, and I thought that he was managing range really well. And in Jermaine Franklin, he had an opponent that had good reflexes. Now, he didn't have Alexander Usyk-like footwork and movement. Jermaine Franklin didn't have that, but he had good reflexes, and he was willing and able to counter. He was ready to counter. And so Anthony Joshua, I think, had that in mind. I think that we saw a growth and kind of an evolution even through this fight in Anthony Joshua's comfortability under the new instructions that he was receiving. So I thought that it was important for Joshua to first establish a jab, especially against a guy who's, slippery enough to try to counter over the top if you are lazy with your jab. So yes, Anthony Joshua was doing some of that paw work, which I heard Chris Algieri kind of criticizing, calling it sort of a lazy jab. And I see that there is a danger in keeping your jab hand out there. But I also want to say that one of the tenets of Derrick James's fighters, if you notice, Errol Spence with his lead right hand since Spence is a southpaw, Jermell Charlo's lead left hand since he's orthodox, they don't only jab with their jab hand. They do they do a lot of glove work where they kind of paw at your glove to try to steer you or redirect you. They do some work where they're using their jab hand around your head area, moving your head around. You see Tyson Fury do a lot of that as well. So I thought that Anthony Joshua was experimenting a good amount with his jab hand. And there was something in Joshua's body language that I don't think sat well with a lot of the audience and a lot of with the commentators. And it looked like he was just kind of standing there a little bit motionless. But what I think that he was actually doing, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, I thought that he was being efficient with his movement. He wasn't wasting energy. And I think that you also see that with Errol Spence. You see that with Jermell Charlo. You see that with Frank Martin. They are very economical in their movement. So Anthony Joshua, no, he wasn't coming forward with reckless abandon, although I do think that I saw some good signs in his inside fighting. Look, all of this to say, I've heard a lot of criticism on this performance, and, I heard Chris Algieri give it a B-. I like what I saw from Anthony Joshua today. No, he didn't knock Jermaine Franklin out. I think that with every Jermaine Franklin fight that we see on this level, Jermaine Franklin's last 2 fights have been against Dillian White and against Anthony Joshua. So we kind of have to reevaluate how good or how resilient and durable he is. And I think Jermaine Franklin came to win. The way that I kind of predicted this one is I thought Anthony Joshua was going to win via decision. I thought that it was going to take on the look or tone of one of those prime Vladimir Klitschko fights where he's got his opponent on the outside of his jab. And it's almost like watching paint dry, where you're just seeing this guy kind of get peppered and popped with the jab hand until the second half of the fight. Sometimes earlier, but often in the second half of the fight, where you would then see Vladimir Klitschko start putting that right hand behind the jab hand and start doing more with the left hooks. Vladimir Klitschko had a great left hook as well as a nice right hand. So Anthony Joshua, I did see some lead left hooks. I saw some of those sweeping left hooks where I'm not even sure he's looking to land that, more so to give the opponent something to look at, where he throws that super wide looking hook, which comes with its own dangers. But I'm sure that Anthony Joshua is ready to put the right hand behind that left hook. They call it the 3-2, you know? But I saw Anthony Joshua doing some nice work with his jab hand. And I thought that it was important that he established that early, so that Jermaine Franklin knows that he's got to like start slipping this, and you don't want to keep on getting popped with that, again, pummeling jab, which then presents a new danger if you worry too much about that jab, because once you start worrying too much about that jab, that's when the right hand comes on top of it, and then you're really in trouble if you don't see that right hand coming. So Jermaine Franklin he's a smart fighter. You could see him kind of being able to defend multiple things at once, but you saw that pattern of Jermaine Franklin starting to dip under Anthony Joshua's sweeping left hooks, under Joshua's right hand often. But then you would see Anthony Joshua then adjust and start throwing those uppercuts. We saw Anthony Joshua nearly decapitate Vladimir Klitschko with one of those uppercuts. He's had that in his arsenal for some time. But there were times in this fight where you could see Anthony Joshua mid-round picking up instruction from Derrick James. So there was one time that he had Jermaine Franklin's head tucked under his arm. He looks over to Jermaine Franklin, he nods his head, and you could tell. I knew what Derrick James was telling him at that point, because you kind of saw the head nod like, oh yeah, I should have thought of that. And then the very next, I was going to call it a possession, like it was basketball or football or something. But at the very next exchange, once they were separated from that clinch position, Anthony Joshua threw that right hand uppercut. He actually threw it twice in a row that time. And you saw Anthony Joshua sometimes alternate hands that he's throwing the uppercuts with. Now, Anthony Joshua, he's still not the trickiest fighter in terms of his punch output. Like, you won't see too many instances of him going with the same power punch twice, where, you know, Caleb Plant, when he knocked out Anthony Durrell, he threw the left hook to the body and then followed it up with the left hook up top. Usually opponents are used to one hand and the other hand, one hand and the other hand. That's why you almost see this movement from a lot of fighters where they could almost do this in their sleep, because they know that you're usually going to alternate hands. It's when you start doubling or even tripling up with one hand that you could throw the person's perceived punch pattern off, where they're expecting one thing, but you're giving them another. Anthony Joshua isn't the trickiest fighter in that regard. Never has been. But I did see some more deception where he would disguise certain things and then throw the uppercut where it's not so telegraphed. And even in the clinches, he would throw sometimes two left-hand uppercuts or right-hand uppercuts in succession, one after the next. And in terms of, you know, I was glad that Boxing Wave, in his breakdown prior to the fight, he called out that people sometimes make too much over Anthony Joshua's mental state. So I do want to talk a little bit about that confidence builder that this fight can be. But I appreciated that he called that out, because, you know, Anthony Joshua is, nearing his mid-30s. He's well into his fight career. If anything, he's on the back half of his fight career. So, you know, anything that you attribute to his mental makeup, that's just a part of Anthony Joshua, and that's not going to change too drastically. But I do think that some of the skill building has room for improvement. So I really do like this coupling of Anthony Joshua and Derrick James. And speaking of confidence builders, he took a lot of shots from Jermaine Franklin, some nice ones. Jermaine Franklin, when he would let that right hand go, and even on the inside, he would shorten his right hand. He, being Jermaine Franklin, would sometimes shorten the right hand, almost where it's like a right-handed hook, and he would catch Anthony Joshua upside the head with a couple of those. I thought Anthony Joshua took those well. But again, between the jab, the uppercut, the economical movement where he's not wasting energy, and I think that that was basically seeing if his cardio can hold over 12 rounds. So I think that it's almost like if you're running more miles than you're used to running, say you're doing like a 6 or 8 mile run when you're used to doing like a 3 or a 4, sometimes you take it a little easy on those first couple miles because you're kind of pacing yourself to go the distance. And sometimes you could even finish stronger in the last 2 or 3 miles because of some of what you saved in the first couple miles of that run. I thought we saw a little bit of that with Anthony Joshua here. So you saw that he was prepared to go a little bit harder in those championship rounds, which we saw. That's where the action kind of picked up. So I think that this fight and the way that it was fought was important for Anthony Joshua's confidence building, his skill development, everything that went into this, the first stage of this rebuild, if you will, even though Anthony Joshua was talking about going right into a Tyson Fury fight next. This is kind of a rebuild of sorts. Now, personally, I would like to see Anthony Joshua take one more fight before a Tyson Fury fight. Now, would that be against Dillian White? Would it be against Deontay Wilder? I would love to see him fight Deontay Wilder. Something tells me that's not what we're going to get next. I don't know what Deontay Wilder is going to do next. I would love to see him fight, he being Wilder, fight Andy Ruiz. I would love to see him fight Anthony Joshua. I don't need to see Tyson Fury versus Wilder 4. But my dream fight is still Anthony Joshua versus Deontay Wilder. But I remember Eddie Hearn saying that they could go straight into, and this was like a week ago, even a few days ago, this was 2 weeks ago. Every time you hear Eddie Hearn talk about this, he was basically saying we could go, if this goes well for Anthony Joshua, we could go straight into the Tyson Fury fight. I would exercise caution unless the idea is that if not now, then never. If that's the sentiment, then okay, I guess might as well do it. But if you're really looking to strengthen the chemistry between Anthony Joshua and Derrick James, I would advise taking one more fight. Maybe a third fight with Andy Ruiz if you're up for it, even though style-wise, that's not going to prepare you well for Tyson Fury. To be honest, I don't know what exactly can prepare you for Tyson Fury, but maybe a taller fighter, maybe somebody taller than 6'5", But again, all that to say, if Chris Algieri gave Anthony Joshua a B-, I would actually give Anthony Joshua a flat B, maybe even a B+. I just think that, maybe we have to give Jermaine Franklin a little more credit here for the way that he was able to fight maybe not an intense and high octane 12 rounds, but definitely a smart 12 rounds, a very defensively minded 12 rounds, and a steadily dangerous where Anthony Joshua knew that he couldn't really over pursue 12 rounds. So yeah, credit to both guys. Again, I thought that this was a good fight. I thought it was a solid performance from Anthony Joshua. And to me, this wasn't something that, grows concern. I didn't watch this fight and say, man, Anthony Joshua just might not be the killer he used to be. I mean, we've had that question for a few fights now. If anything, I thought that this was a step in the right direction. We saw Anthony Joshua letting his right hand go in certain parts of this fight. And again, we saw him mixing it up with the uppercuts. We saw him go to the body a bit. Yes, Anthony Joshua did get caught by Jermaine Franklin with a few left hooks to the body. But this, 255-pound version of Anthony Joshua, I was impressed with the cardio. I was impressed with how he absorbed punches to the body and up top. There were some very good signs. And if he could stay 255, because he said that he's not weight training. He said he's sparring and he's boxing training, and wherever his weight ends up, it ends up. And I almost like that idea because you're training to box. You're not trying to get to a certain weight. You're not trying to shred to 235 or blow up to 260. It's just, let's train like we're boxing. Let's do the sparring and get these very tough workouts. Let's get them in the books and let's see where we end up. So if Anthony Joshua remains 255 and starts putting these skills on top of that, hey man, like this might end up being, in 1 or 2 fights down the road, might end up being the best version of Anthony Joshua. We don't know yet. And when people talk about, well, that killer that was Anthony Joshua, look, Anthony Joshua went the full 12-round distance with Joseph Parker. He didn't finish him. He did finish the, 37, 38-year-old Alexander Povetkin after being in trouble in the early rounds. But, he was fighting guys like, if it wasn't Charles Martin, it was, Molina. It was Dominic Brazil. I'm not sure that those guys at the stage that they were when they fought Anthony Joshua are necessarily better than Jermaine Franklin. I would like to see Jermaine. You know what I would like to see? I would like to see Jermaine Franklin versus Otto Wallin. Let's just see what happens between those two. I don't know how that would go, but I mean, Otto Wallin, ever since that impressive showing against Tyson Fury, he's pretty much been on the sideline. I would have liked to see Dillian White versus Otto Wallin, but it's almost like Otto Wallin feels like he's entitled to like the biggest of big fights at this point. I'm like, yo, how about getting a really, really good win first? Like fight Philip Ergovich or Zhang Zheli. I know Zhang Zheli is about to fight, Joe Joyce, but fight one of these guys that's like maybe a top 8. Fight Luis Ortiz. Get a good win under your belt so then you could call out some of the bigger names. Until then, Jermaine Franklin versus Otto Wallin doesn't sound like a bad idea. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on how Anthony Joshua looked in this win against Jermaine Franklin. I would be more encouraged. If you're an AJ fan, be encouraged by this performance rather than discouraged. I know his body language sometimes looks weird. I know that he doesn't smile as much these days as he used to. I know he looks a little bit more sullen and sulky. And, he did some cheap stuff, first with that punch after the bell had clearly sounded and the ref was between the two guys. That was pretty cheap, pretty questionable. And then at the end of the fight, after the final bell sounded, that led to the kind of, the brief scuffle where Anthony Joshua kind of tied up Jermaine Franklin after. You know what I thought Anthony Joshua was doing? I thought that he was kind of like, just kind of tapping him. You know how somebody will like tap the other guy in the head like, hey man, good fight. One of those things. I thought that that's what Anthony Joshua was doing. I thought that he just did it after Jermaine Franklin already turned his back. So it looked like he hit him in the back of the head. That's how I interpreted it as it happened. Then I saw Anthony Joshua then look over his shoulder, almost looking at how Jermaine Franklin took that. You know what I mean? That's what I thought Anthony Joshua was looking at. And then when he saw Jermaine took it, not how it might have been intended. Again, this is just me reading into it. Then Anthony Joshua walked up to him and just kind of held him like, hey man, I didn't mean anything by it, is how I read that. And then when he got a different energy from Jermaine Franklin, then it became more of an adversarial encounter. But yeah, it was chippy. Anthony Joshua acknowledged as much, but I thought that overall that the performance was a good one. Please let me know your thoughts on this fight in the comments. And where should Anthony Joshua go from here? Should he go right into the Fury fight? Should he fight somebody else? And if he fights somebody else, should it be a top 6 or top 6 to 10 heavyweight? Or should he fight somebody else around Jermaine Franklin's skill level, but maybe a different style? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.